If we are to take Descartes' most famous conjectures as fact, that a priori structures exist, that certain things can exist without any proof, then this does open some doors I would like to illustrate. The main thing we know for certain exists as humans is our own existence, but there are rules to this, because it is quite a complex thing to identify oneself without knowing what one is exactly. But I will not start here. Instead, I want you to just know that you do exist, and in this scenario I lay before you, you are a film camera. Nothing fancy, but you are, in fact, a film camera. More abstractly, you are an undefined perspective in an undefined time and an undefined place sitting on a beach. You are not capable of knowing that you are a film camera, or performing any type of thought or any type of reaction to stimulus, but you do exist, and you are recording film. As you take more and more film, nothing changes, but you do indeed experience this film as it is being taken. You of course do not have the short-term memory or long-term memory to understand in any way what is happening, so your perspective, because you are a perspective, is strictly binded to the experience of an instantaneous moment-to-moment piece of footage. Now, if a scientist were to walk up to you and had the notion that perhaps this film camera had a perspective within it, you would not be able to verify that you exist as you do right now. Touché, Mr. Scientist, but the camera does not know it exists either, so this would be quite difficult to do. What would happen to the perspective that is the film camera if it were to break apart? How did the film camera have a perspective? Let us for now propose that a mechanism behind the lens connected the perspective to the film as it was taken, so it could perceive it. When the camera breaks, the perspective remains, but has no mechanism relaying the footage to it, and now exists as if the footage being relayed has now stopped. Now the perspective no longer has any functions. When I say functions, however, I of course mean this in a very literal sense. Let us reaffirm that the perspective is a separate object that exists separate from the physical object of the camera. The information of the footage from moment to moment is created by the camera, which is then interpreted by the perspective as an image. This is an important distinction to make. The perspective doesn't actually make anything, it just has the end product of the original function. This has many similarities to the concepts of differentiation and integration in mathematics. When taking a particular function into account, differentiation and integration are entirely based upon the original function, but redefine how it behaves into a different function. This other function exists conceptually, but is still directly linked to the original function. I propose that this perspective within the camera behaves in the same way. It does not exist within physical reality as its own object, but instead is the redefined viewpoint, the result of a physical object that performs a particular function. It is the conceptual product of a physical mechanism. Now imagine we wanted to increase the functions of the camera, and therefore increase the functions of the interpreted perspective. There now exists a mechanism that can make a distinction between light and dark footage, and activates a series of motors that move the camera towards brighter sources of light using wheels attached to the bottom. This would be an example of a simple automated process, but the perspective is still there in the background. But it now has the ability to perceive new viewpoints as the machine tumbles along towards brighter territory. Eventually, mechanisms might be made for the camera to gather additional film reels so that it might continue the stream of footage. Of course, this would only come about if a third party, like a scientist, was building these functions into the camera in an effort to aid the perspective. But that's too inefficient. Perhaps the camera could be built with an additional base function to build other cameras that are slightly different, and cameras eventually build a camera society through camera evolution. Eventually the cameras build circuits for emotions, which results in the perspective gaining the conceptual ability to experience emotions. Eventually the cameras have enough mechanisms for the perspective to realize that it is a camera. This is what a human being is. There does, however, seem to be a problem with this. We have a perspective and experience reality, not as a sum of parts, but as the conceptual product of those redefined parts. Pain exists to us without need for deductive reasoning. Pleasure exists without deductive reasoning. Where exactly is pain in physical reality? Well, it's a series of neurons and neurotransmitters in the brain sending a signal that means pain. But to us, as the conceptual being, there's nothing subtle about the experience. It simply is. We may not physically exist, but we do, however, exist. If we are to take cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, with any seriousness. Imagine that. Human consciousness is just a concept in a conceptual plane recognizing itself. Further evidence for this might be that we can also seem to easily segment, divide, and manipulate the physical brain to have differences in the type and amount of our perspective. To completely destroy the prefrontal cortex is to destroy all functions associated with that area, which extends to the conceptual being, but what seems to remain constant is that a perspective does always exist. But I will leave you with a question. When we make the jump towards noticing that the conceptual and physical are separate, if we are to notice that the perspective must have had a beginning, middle, and end on both dimensions, where did the conceptual portion originate before it was embodied and given sentience by a physical structure? We can only assume that it was a part of the background of the conceptual universe, or some other unexplained means.